I went a little bit long this morning, and I was asked, I won't tell you who, maybe I could keep it a little bit shorter tonight. Well, when I was done laughing, I said, sure, I'll try. And then I laughed a little more. No, I just wanted to really a slight overview of the book of James and a couple of things that we can see there. James, it falls, obviously, several books and letters after Matthew. And so if you don't already know, you might be surprised that it was the first New Testament letter written. We often look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, because they're at the beginning. We think maybe they were written first, but it's actually James. And James, most scholars tend to believe that it was written around AD 50, so approximately 27 years after Pentecost. And so imagine that you have the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, okay? You have that, and then 27 years go by. And you don't have any letter. All you really have is word of mouth. And the apostles going out and preaching and teaching. And then this letter comes along. And it is written, we see there in verse 1, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. And so what that is, it's to Jewish Christians. So over the course of this 27 years, we have Jews who have converted from Judaism over to Christianity. So it's Jewish Christians. And at the time, there was a lot of persecution in the Roman Empire, and they were cast out of many areas and dispersed. In some translations, it might say the diaspora, or some may say those in exile, but it's the same thing. Now, at first, we might say, well, how is that possible to just cast a bunch of people out? Well, if you go back to the 1940s, it's not so hard to believe, considering that is exactly one of the things that Adolf Hitler tried to do, was to eliminate the Jewish people. So Rome tried to do that as well. And so this is the first letter that is received by new Christians. And there's a couple of things that I really just wanted to point out. Before we get into those few items, I wanted to ask a question, and it's just something to kind of mull over in your mind as we're going through this. Let's say you have a child, boy or girl, doesn't matter, or a grandchild if the parents have passed on, whatever the case may be. But you have a youth who is of marrying age, okay? And they have fallen in love with someone. They've dated and they've spent some time together, and, they've maybe had this on and off again type of relationship. And so we'll just take a young man, and he goes to his parents and he says, I think I'm in love. Well, of course, if you don't already, you want to get to know this young lady, and she tells you all of the right things. Now, this is your son, and you know how he is, and in your eyes, like in most parents' eyes, their child is perfect. They can do no wrong, right? Yeah, okay. I'm not saying that parents aren't delusional. I'm a parent myself. But that's how we may often see them. And so you get to know this young girl. And, she says all of the right things, does all the right things. And you say, okay, well, I think that y'all will be a good match, right? And so later on, they get married. Well, and then this young woman has an affair and goes outside of the marriage. And your son is distraught. He tells you about it, but he doesn't really have to even tell you about it. You can already read the room, so to speak. You know that something is amiss. And as a parent, you confront her. She said, it was a mistake. A stupid mistake. I'll never do it again. Okay. We'll let it go. If he's willing to be there, then, Who am I to stand in the way, right? Then let's say a month goes by and there's another affair and another apology, another forgiveness. A month goes by, another affair, another apology, another forgiveness. And if it makes you feel more comfortable, it could be your daughter and the guy, he's the cad who's running around on your daughter, if you want to look at it that way, okay? Now, I just want you to keep that. Now, ask yourself, just in your own mind, is that a relationship that you would want your son to be a part of or your daughter to be a part of? To cling to someone, to be devoted to someone. After all, he or she, son or daughter, has been absolutely faithful, never wavered, never even thought about it. Would you want them to be in a relationship with someone who did not treat them the way that they wanted to be treated? I don't think any of us would. Now, I'm not saying that the divorce is the first answer, but we know affair after affair after affair, forgiveness after forgiveness, and what have you. And so I just want you to kind of think about that relationship and whether you would want your son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter or great-grandson or great-granddaughter involved in that type of relationship. Or would you say you need to drop them like a bad habit, they're absolutely no good for you, and they're bringing you down? And it may be, if you're of the older generation, it might be that you believe all a man has is his name. I remember there was a country song. I can't remember who sang it. I think it was called My Last Name. He couldn't give the girl riches or anything. He said, but what I can give you is my name. And so just think about that in your mind for a few moments as we look at a couple of items in James. So now these are, we know that the letter of James is written by the brother of Christ. I know some people call him a half-brother. I don't really do that because Jesus never called anybody a half-brother or a half-sister. He said, this is my mother, these are my brothers, these are my sisters. So it was written by the brother of Christ. Now, James, being a brother of Christ, we know from elsewhere in Scripture, he didn't initially believe in Jesus, not as the Messiah, right? He probably grew up in his shadow. James's birth narrative, it's not as extravagant as Jesus's, right? We don't have angels visiting over James, and we don't have, babies leaping in the womb when Mary comes close and all of this. And so there might have even been some animosity there. But James, who was also an elder at the church in Jerusalem, and we know that from Acts chapter 15 and the Jerusalem Council where he speaks. But he writes this letter. These are the first things that they're hearing. Now, in chapter 1, James talks about the testing of one's faith, going through trials and being refined. We discussed some of that this morning. But later in chapter 1, he talks about hearing and doing the word. Now remember, he is speaking to Jewish Christians, not Gentile Christians, but Jewish Christians. And many of them are still holding on to the Mosaic law. The Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15 had to do with people trying to mix physical circumcision with Christianity in order for people to be joined to Christ. But he starts there in verse 19 of chapter 1. Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. Therefore, put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. And then verse 22, but be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away, and at once forgets what he was like. I'm just going to go ahead and pause right there because it makes the point. See, these were a people who had spent their childhood, maybe much of their adulthood, depending upon their conversion, listening to various teachers. You think of the apostles at this time maybe being kind of like a circuit preacher. You know, they're here and then they move on to another place and then they'll eventually kind of get back around. But in the meantime, they still have Sadducees, Pharisees, and scribes that are hanging out around the synagogue, teaching and preaching Judaism. And we know this to be the case because Paul, when he's finding the congregation or establishing the congregation in Thessalonica, the first thing that he does is go to the synagogue to preach. That was the method that Paul used. If you want to know what that might look like, it would be me, let's say, I'm not Paul, but let's just say, that he wouldn't come to a Church of Christ on Sunday morning. Instead, he would go to the Baptist church down the road, tell them what's wrong and what they need to do to get right. That's the idea that Paul was doing. He would go to the synagogue and he would preach Christ as the Messiah. That is what it looked like. But so these people, they are used to hearing the Judaizing teachers more. They're not used to actually doing the work. See, the work, it was all set for the teachers. And that's from part of the old Levitical system. When the Levites, who were the priests, they were set apart. They were that holy nation. They were the priests. They were to do all of the sacrifices and everything. And here James comes in and he says, no, that's not the way that it works. You can't just go listen to someone talk. You actually have to get up, go out, and be doers of the word. And then he goes in, verse 25, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. Now that alone, even though this is to Jewish Christians, there is a lesson here for us. Is that we can't just show up on Sunday mornings, Sunday nights, and Wednesday nights and be faithful at every single service. It's not going to make a lick of difference if we're not going out into the community and being doers of the word. It does not matter. We can't come in here and put our face to some proverbial mirror and say, I'm a Christian. I'm here in worship service. I'm praising God because Mike, he leads excellent singing. Perry leads excellent singing. We hear great prayers. I'm a Christian, by golly. And then just forget who we are as soon as we exit the doors. There is a little sticker that's up there that beyond these doors lies the mission field. You've heard me say it before. Every sinner a mission field, every saint a missionary. We don't have to go across the world. All we've got to do is go across the street. So there's a lesson here. You can't just listen to the teachers, you Christian Jews, he's saying. You got to get out and you got to do the work. And then we get, and also in this, we might be reminded of Matthew 23, verses 25 and 26, where there Jesus, he's talking to the Pharisees, and it's one of the 7 woes, where he says, woe, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. And he says, look, you're all focused and everything about washing the outside of the cup and the outside of the platter. But that's not doing any good on the inside. What you need to do is get right from the inside out. We can go through all the motions that we want to, but if our heart's not in the right place, if our mind's not in the right place, then no one really cares. And Jesus, the whole host of heaven, looks at us and with a sad shake of the head just says, Christians, woe to you, hypocrites. It doesn't take much. There's a fine line between them being called hypocrites and us being called hypocrites. We get over here to chapter 2, and this might speak more to us than anything, but it's the sin of partiality. Chapter 2 of James, there's a little bit of reading, so yeah, when someone asked me to be short and I laughed, I was serious about that. It's not short. But chapter 2 in James, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory. For if a man wearing a gold ring and fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and if you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and you say, sit here in a good place, while you say to the poor man, you stand over there or sit down at my feet, you're not even giving him a place to sit. Have you not then made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom, which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? Are they not the ones who blaspheme the honorable name by which you are called? We do that a lot in the world today. And not just in the church, but I'm talking to the church. Someone may come in dressed in a way that maybe it might cause us to look twice, and might even cause us to not approach them because we're not sure of how they are. Or we're focused on so much on how people dress when they come to services. Look, I'll tell you my personal feelings. Take it for what it is. I think that we should be giving God our best when we come to services. But I don't believe that it's a material best. After all, if someone were to say, Mike, you need to wear your best suit. Okay, how do you base that off of? Do you base it off of the money that I spent? The fabric that was used, whether I'm wearing a vest or even, one of those Monopoly guy monocles on my eye? I mean, what are we basing it off of? Because after all, we're looking at the outside, but God's saying, what is this person? What is their best? Are they doing the absolute best that they can do? Are they serving? And everybody should be treated equally. I'm not saying that we don't treat people equally, but we can have a tendency not to, if we're being honest. And it might not be the way that they're dressed. It might be a personal belief that they have that maybe we don't understand, or an action that they have that we don't know, or a lifestyle that they live. And you know what? I have heard people say, you know what? I do not want, just as an example, I don't want homosexuals in the church. Okay, first of all, we're not talking about the church. We're talking about a church building, okay? Second of all, I personally believe, now I'm not condoning the lifestyle one least bit, but if Christians aren't going out and preaching the Word of God, where else are they going to hear it but inside the four walls of a church building? Now, that's just my personal opinion. Take it for what it is. Again, Jesus, he went out to the people. He preached to the people. He spoke with the people. It didn't matter their station in life. You've got tax collector over here. You've got fisherman over here. You got a zealot over here. Didn't matter. Everybody needs Jesus. And we should not show partiality when it comes to that. Partiality, it's not just about lifestyle either. It could be about sex. It could be that women are second-class citizens. I mean, after all, we had to have the suffrage movement and everything for women to just be able to vote. Going back even further than that, it would be the enslaved black people who were not worthy of it. Savages, Christians would call them. And that's so sad, and that there's partiality all over the place. And so that's a lesson for us. And so it's not just about being doers of the word, but it's being doers showing no partiality to whom we are carrying out the word for. Because we're not carrying it out for that person, we're carrying it out for Christ. Now, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, we've got over in chapter 3, he talks about taming the tongue. And he starts off, not many of you should become teachers, my brother, for you know that we who teach will be judged with the greater strictness. Now again, these are a people who had been listening to these Pharisees and Sadducees yawn on and on at the synagogues, trying to mix things up a little bit. So I'm just going to turn over here to Matthew 23 real quick and read some of this. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat, so do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do, for they preach, but they do not practice. So James, he's really reiterating here what Jesus had already said about these teachers, that they were not doers of the word. They were just hearers only, and I don't even know if they were hearers. They might have just been speakers. But they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves aren't willing to move them with their finger. They're doing all of this. They're showing partiality and what have you. They're not able to tame their tongue. And then we get a little bit later in that same chapter. And to start off in verse 13, but woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you shut up the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. You neither enter yourselves nor allow those who would enter to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. Now here's an interesting one. For you travel across sea and land to make a single proselyte. And when he becomes a proselyte, you make him twice as much a child of hell as yourself. It's like you're going all over the place trying to convert people to you and not to God. Not to Christ. And you're trying to put all of these laws on people, and you're speaking where you have no reason to speak. Now, again, we're looking at 27 years later when we get to James. And he's saying, not everybody should be a teacher. It's better to be a doer of the word than a teacher even. And so he speaks of that and of taming the tongue. And then in chapter 4, there's a warning there against worldliness. And I'm going to come back to that and skip over to chapter 5 of James. Come now, you rich. This is beginning in verse 1. Weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidenced against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure in the last days. Now, over in Matthew chapter 6, Jesus, he would talk about this. That's that middle chapter of the Sermon on the Mount there in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And he would tell, don't lay up treasures here on earth, where thieves break in and steal, where moths eat and things rust up, but lay up for your treasures in heaven. And so he's talking to these Jewish Christians. This is the first letter that they get 27 years later. And James has practically turned everything on its head. Don't just listen to the teachers. In fact, not everybody should be teachers. You're going to go through trials. You're dispersed. You're scattered abroad. The Roman Empire doesn't want you anywhere near them. Be doers of the word anyways. And don't show partiality when you're doing it. I don't care if that person is a Gentile, whether they're Athenian or Greek. I don't care. Show no partiality. I don't care if they're rich or poor, man or woman, male or female. Well, that's man or woman. I'm getting ahead of myself. Slave or free, show no partiality to them. Yeah, I say man and woman twice just to make sure in today's time that we recognize as man and woman, okay? Genesis 1:26 and 7. And he gets here and he's like, there are people, even people among you, because he says, come now, you rich. So he is specifically addressing Jewish Christians who are focused more on wealth than they are on Christ. And he reiterates really what Christ said again. Stop laying up these riches for you because they're going to corrode and it's going to show. That's going to be the evidence against you. Now, just to close, I asked that question in the beginning about would you want your son or daughter, grandson, granddaughter, to stay in a relationship, to stay in a marriage with someone who is just having affair after affair after affair? And the answer probably, you don't even have to say it, but the answer is more than likely no, not at all. They're not worthy of my son, or they're not worthy of my daughter. Now, back in chapter 4, when in warning against worldliness, starting in verse 4, this is how it starts. You adulterous people. He's talking to Jewish Christians. This is the first letter that they can touch and feel and read the words after 27 years. And he starts verse 4, you adulterous people. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you suppose it is to no purpose that the scripture says he yearns jealously over the spirit that he has made to dwell within us? You adulterous people, Probably everyone in this room who gave thought to the question that I asked earlier probably said in their minds, no, absolutely not. I wouldn't want that person in a relationship. Well, then let me follow it up with a second question, because he's talking to Christians here. He calls them adulterous people because they're friends of the world. Should Jesus stay in a relationship with us if we're an adulterous people going out week after week chasing the world, month after month chasing the world, and then we come back asking for forgiveness, saying, I'll never do it again, I promise. Okay, I forgive you. And then we turn around and go back and do it again. I'll never do it again, I promise. If you were God and Jesus your son, would you want him to stay in a relationship with you? And that's a question that we have to ask ourselves each and every day. Are we an unfaithful spouse to Christ? Because the church is the bride of Christ. And one day, we're going to have to answer to our father-in-law. As you go this week, consider that. Not just in your, if you're married, not just in that relationship, if you're dating someone, not just in that relationship, but ask yourself as a Christian, consider, I am a bride to the Son of God, but am I a faithful one? And then strive not to just say, I'm sorry, it'll never happen again, but strive to be faithful. Yes, there's going to be temptation out there, but we don't have to fall into it. Not if we set our eyes on our spouse, on our husband, and we say, for him and him alone am I available. If there's any way that I can help, I'd be happy to talk. If you want to talk to someone else, please do that. And if you need the prayers of the congregation, then we will pray with you and for you. But if there's anything you'd like to make known publicly, you can do that by coming forward as we stand and as we sing.